It's like,
Oh, can you hit okay?
Ted Cruz. Yeah.
Okay.
I was gonna say Ted Cruz. Is the youngest professor.
You ready? Do you want to come over here? Or you want to wait till your part and then come over here?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
So I can just charge up.
So,
Or actually, I don't need my laptop.
I'm gonna go over here. Or
Yeah.
here. Sophia's coming to sit by me. So, first to start, hello, everyone. We are Juliette and
Sofia.
and we will be presenting today's topic on recentering indigeneity, as you hopefully can see. So the way it's going to work, first I just want to go over guidelines, like please be respectful, no like hate comments, nothing like that. But yeah, so we're going to just be kind of having a discussion about Indigenous culture, Indigenous thought, and also like the impact of
Colonization.
Thank you. On them. So I'm kind of going to start with the first bit of like the history and some like more anthropological part of it, and then Sofia will jump in and talk about modern.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of talk about like a couple policies that people are really looking at right now with regard to like Indigenous sovereignty, and then just like the conditions of reservations and just some movements that Indigenous people are working on right now.
Yeah, so let's get started. So the first thing that I think is important to talk about, and something that most universities nowadays do discuss, but beyond that, I don't see much discussion on, especially in America. But I know, well, hopefully we'll have some, well, we have some people in England, a person in England. It's really important to recognize that the land we stand on in America is Indigenous land and was originally, you know, taken care of and lived on by people other than the colonizer. And one thing you should always just kind of be aware of is wherever you are in America, this could be Canada, the United States, this could be Central America, and I mean all over the world as well. It's important to recognize like the blood that was shed on the land we are on, and the fact that the land we are on was not originally ours. So with that being said, I think we want to say that we are on Ohlone land right now, which is the Indigenous tribe that lived in the Berkeley area and the Bay Area. There are a lot of other tribes in California. There's a lot of tribes throughout the United States. So there's one thing you can do right now is if you text your zip code to this number, which I would really like for everyone to do, you can figure out what, within a few minutes, it takes sometimes it's a little slow. You can figure out what Indigenous tribe you are living on, what land, whose land you are living on. And if you want to like type it in the chat and like send it in the chat, say where you are now, and then say what land you are on. So everyone here is on Ohlone land, but you can also check out like where you're from.
Hometowns would be
cool.
If
anyone wants to also just unmute and shout it out, that's cool too.
I got a weird text for that number, but I do.
Is that not the right number?
It says the phone number is
Yeah.
No.
But I just happen to know what
Okay.
land Daisy and I are from.
Yeah.
We are from Tonga land.
Okay. Well, then a quick Google search can do the same thing because
yes.
This doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm from the central coast of California, which is Chumash generally. There's actually a lot in the area, but
what do we type? Can you what do we Google?
So if you just Google Indigenous tribe from Charleston, South Carolina, like what Indigenous land is Charleston, South Carolina? Allie, did you happen to Google it?
Yeah, I Googled, because England's not really helpful. I Googled what Indigenous land is Providence on, Providence, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. And Brown did a land acknowledgement for the Narragansett Indian tribe. We had a lot of protests my first year there, for which the land acknowledgement, as I'm sure y'all will talk about, did not really help do what they wanted. But yeah, because Brown owns land that used to be a Narragansett like museum, and it's still owned by, and it was like literally like a sanctuary or a sacred site. I don't know, y'all would know more about it than me, but I'm excited to hear more from y'all.
Anybody else?
So Nashville, David and I are in Cherokee East, Yuki, and Shawnee.
Oh, that's cool.
I'm from Miwok and
Here, it said Indigenous land by zip code. Did you do that?
What about you, Alex?
The Tequesta Indians are the ones who lived in Miami. There's like some monuments to them downtown. They mostly lived on the river. They hunted like manatees and sharks and stuff. They built like huge nets that would go across the Miami River. And I'm pretty sure Miami is an indigenous word that means like people of the peninsula or like people who live downstream or something like that. That's why there's a Miami in Florida and a Miami in Ohio, which is also a peninsular kind of river region.
That's really cool. Yeah, I think Charleston is on Seawee land or Sewee land. And it's okay that I know it's hard to pronounce some of these, like, but there are ways to look up pronunciations, which we can talk about later. So yeah, that's really cool. I encourage you guys also just with this to talk to your friends about it. Like when you're in, if there's a way to bring it up in conversation, just remind people like, hey, we are on indigenous land, like the Sewee or the Ohlone or whomever it is, they are the proper inheritors of the land. But we will kind of get more into this in a bit.
I just tried it. No, that's a
So
different number.
firstly, I think it's important to go over some terminology. So we, or I, and I believe you will be using the term indigenous throughout this presentation, but it's important to recognize that like, it's really up to the tribe, it's up to the indigenous group to decide what term they used. Some people like native, some people like Indian, some use indigenous, some use tribal. All of these have different connotations associated to it. I personally really like the word indigenous. This is a great quote from a scholarly article that I have linked here. It says, the word indigenous refers to the notion of a place-based human ethnic culture that has not migrated from its homeland and is not a settler or colonial population. To be indigenous is therefore by definition different from being of a world culture such as the Western or Euro-American culture. So being indigenous means being native to the land. It means, you know, not having any, like, you weren't colonizing it, you didn't come in and, you know, no genocide occurred. So especially like in discussion with North American and Central American indigenous people, those are the people that originally were on the land. And of course you have to recognize like they did at some point migrate here. You know, Pangea was a thing. If you don't know what that is like when all of the continents were together and they migrated. It's disputed the different ways, but you know, whatever. We're not going to get into that. It gets a little too complicated, but just for terminology, indigenous, if you are not of native descent or indigenous descent, indigenous is typically the best word to use, unless you are in a tribe and you can then decide for yourself. But it's just the safest term, least like negative connotations associated. So before we get into like all the crazy stuff, just some like very brief historical contextualization. This will be kind of going over history, anthropology, and then geographical context. So to start, I think it's really important to recognize just how many indigenous populations and tribes are in North America. I did not count these because there are a ton, as you can see, and sorry, this map isn't the best. One thing that is important to note is there are very few, if any, maps that, this is the best I could find, of indigenous lands and indigenous tribes in North America and Central America for that matter. This was done by someone named Aaron Carlisle or something like that. I can't remember his last name, but he is a independent map maker from Oklahoma who recognized this issue that there aren't very many maps of tribal lands and tribal names with their traditional names that exist in the modern age. So he has been on a hunt to create this map, and it's ever evolving. When these slides come out, all of the links that I'm using are in the notes of the slides. And it's important to note that this map does use traditional names, which is very different. Some of the names that are used to describe tribes are not the names that the tribes actually use of themselves, which you're going to go into a little bit more. Sofia will talk about that later. And I found this quote that I think is a very good quote to explain why having a map with the traditional names is so important. Sofia, would you like to read the quote?
Sure. It's like having a map of North America where the United States is labeled gringos and Mexico is labeled wetbacks, Herman says. Naming is an exercise in power. Whether you're naming places or naming peoples, you are therefore asserting a power of establishing what is reality and what is not.
Yeah, and I'm going to go to the next slide because it's a little bit clearer. This is, you know, the United States, for example, but I think one thing we forget is like names, especially like whether it's what you call somebody else, what you're calling a group. The name you choose to call them is incredibly important. And I mean, whether you follow like Christianity, I mean, they think about the Bible and like when God names things, that's like a very fundamental and important thing. And a lot of religions believe that. And like that quote said, like using a name that isn't the traditional name For example, Cherokee is, you can see it kind of in the Tennessee area. It's Aniunwia, and that would be the traditional name that the Cherokee people would use for them. And it's just really important to recognize that we should be looking into the names. We should be trying to understand like what these are. And again, Sophia's going to talk about that more in a bit, but
Briefly.
yeah, very briefly. But I just want you guys to be aware that like there are a lot more tribes and a lot more areas or indigenous populations that were in America, and most of them. Sorry, Steph was trying to eat things. So yeah, just this is a great map. It's linked here. You can buy these maps prints, which are really helpful, and I honestly might buy one and donate it to my high school, which I think everyone should do. But yeah, so that's something just to consider. And then we're going to get into the more depressing side of it. So as we all know, the Columbian Exchange happened. While it is important to note that Columbus did not discover America, that is false. That is not the way we should ever talk about it. He chose to colonize America, and he rediscovered something that has been around for a long time and has people that lived on it for a long time. And I bring up this map. If you don't know what the Columbian Exchange is, it's okay. It's basically when it kind of was the start of the slave trade and things like that, but it was when people from Europe went around Africa and then brought things to the Americas and then brought the American things to Europe and created this kind of globalization of different goods and fruits and things like that. But the most important thing that we're going to be looking at is the infiltration of disease. So this is a great map because it actually labels the many of other diseases that were brought to the Americas from Europe. So that includes smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, etc. And these like massacred the indigenous populations. But beyond that, the colonizer also brought obviously a lot of violence and pain. And I thought this was a very beautifully sad but beautiful picture because it just kind of shows the chaos and the pain and the way we look at the indigenous people. So when colonizers came, when Europeans quote unquote settled in America, they not only brought disease, they not only desecrated the environment. I think that's another important thing to note. Not only were they killing them with literal disease, but they were also killing them by taking away their resources and literally killing them. Sorry, Sappho. So yeah, this is a quote or a statistic I found. Following Columbus's arrival into North America, 90% of indigenous population was killed by violence and disease. And one thing we don't really say that needs to be said is that this was a genocide. This was not just settleization or colonization. This was not just being settlers coming in. This was a true genocide of people. And by 1600, more than 50 million indigenous people perished at the hands of Europeans. And then one thing I really want to talk about is the reception of this. So beyond just the actual like death and destruction of indigenous people, one thing that I talk about a lot in my classes is the way that Americans, the way that Americans and Europeans, or I don't mean Americans, like Europeans in America, the way they portrayed indigenous people really like created a very long-lasting poor reception of them, and it leads into the modern day, and that's what Sofia will talk about. But this is a very famous picture that was published by an American artist for like a newspaper, and it is a picture of America and this sort of Indian princess trope, and then the Queen of England. And as you can see here, like she is naked, of course, which is something that was not a thing. Nudity was not very well dealt with at the time. They never would depict a woman as nude. She has on the like tobacco leaves, which is a sacred element for a lot of indigenous cultures. Like tobacco leaves were not something they would wear. They were something that they considered sacred and would not like mess with in the way that they are portraying. And there's also like these weird like mushrooms and things that they just tried to make it as exoticized and unrealistic as possible. And it's important to note that this woman that they are portraying as Indian is clearly white-skinned, which would not have been true. And this is like part of the whitewashing of indigenous culture and of the way we look at indigenous people. And this is just one of many. So the other trope is this savage Indian trope that emerged from this. And you have to remember again that these European colonizers are coming in and ruthlessly killing and getting in battles with these relatively peaceful Amerindians. And this is a depiction of, quote, "at the mercy of savage captors, torture by slow fires." And a lot of these propaganda like images of propaganda would appear where it showed the indigenous population as savage and brutal, and they used these terminology that created a very negative impact on how viewers received indigenous people. And it's important to note that they also sent these to Europe, a area that never saw indigenous people of the Americas. Like they have never encountered an indigenous person. And a lot of the paintings were being done by Europeans who had never gone to America, which is another very important thing to note. Like the last painting definitely was by someone who had never seen what an American, native indigenous person looks like. And these harmful and false stereotypes led to violent confrontations and widespread fear and hatred towards, towards indigenous populations. So you can see here they're hanging for European men and like killing and scalping, and all of these ideas of this savage Indian trope just created a very violent and very, it created a norm for like acceptance of the violence being perpetrated against indigenous people. And there are like countless of these images. And then we lead to the boarding schools, which is kind of what I am most interested in my like line of work. So in 1819, the Indian Civilization Act Fund started this whole forced Christianization process. And this was when legislators, along with Christians and different like bishops and I don't remember the terminology, but different Christian leaders got together and they said, look, we need to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man. And both of these legislation were what led to the boarding schools. So they thought if they took indigenous children away from their homes, put them in boarding schools and taught them Christianity and taught them the quote unquote European ideals and identities, it would then fix them. And it would create, they wanted to create them, they wanted to have them live with them in peace, but they wanted to do so in a way that was very violent and harmful to their culture and completely diminished the cultural and norms that they had within their own family groups and within their own identities. So the impact of this was a cultural genocide. Hundreds of thousands of indigenous children were removed from their homes and placed in these boarding schools. And these boarding schools were not good. They were not strong. They were not good places for indigenous people to be in. And by 1926, about 100 years, a century after that, nearly 83% of indigenous school-age children were attending these boarding schools, many of whom ended up perishing at them. And the records that are held about these boarding schools are very vague. They did not keep a very good account of how many children were attending. They did not keep account of how many children were dying. Luckily, we have a lot of primary source documents now, which we'll get into in a second. I do want to talk about the role of archaeology in this and why in the modern age, just moving to modernity, like how we are working to not fix the past, but working to reorient the way we view these boarding schools and fix the way we understand them and educate on them. So recently, within the past 2 years, Canada has started using archaeological technology and archaeological devices to locate the remains of the children and others at these residential schools. And this happened by accident. They decided to start looking into these boarding schools to understand like the marked graves and to give the children's bodies back to their tribes so that they could do proper burials. And they found hundreds of children. And before Canada had started examining these school grounds in 2021, no one knew the extent of the damage done to Indigenous children. So in May of 2021, this is when Canada started their archaeological excavations. Over 200 children's bodies were found in unmarked graves in the former grounds of Kamloops Indian Residential School in Canada. This is not the picture, but this is a similar one. Since then, Canada has worked very hard to ensure the justice for these children and proper reburials of their bodies. And they formed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which since then has confirmed over 3,000 school children died while attending these schools. Realistically, this is probably a much higher number of children who actually died. And Canada is actively working to use different technology like ground penetrating radar and actual excavation to find these bodies, find these children's get a more accurate number and allow them to have the proper burials they would want. And by 1885, 106 schools had been established, which we are the schools that are being excavated. And there, I found a student's account, and it says, intimidation and fear were very much present in our daily lives. For instance, we would cower from the abusive disciplinary practices of some superiors, such as the one who yanked my cousin's ear hard enough to tear it. After a 9-year-old girl was raped in her dormitory bed during the night, we girls would be so scared that we would jump into each other's bed as soon as the lights went out. The sustained terror in our hearts further tested our endurance, as it was better to suffer with a full bladder and be safe than to walk through the dark, seemingly endless hallway to the bathroom. When we were older, we girls anguished each time we entered the classroom of a certain male teacher who stalked and molested girls. And these are accounts that Canada is actually working to like have these conversations with the people who were unfortunately had to attend these boarding schools. And Canada is doing a lot to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and to make sure that they are altering the narrative and making sure that this is discussed and properly dealt with. However, what about America? In June of 2021, the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative was formed. And what they did is they recognized the boarding schools. They used historical records to identify boarding schools and marked and looked at the marked and unmarked burial sites. They found that from 1819 to 1969, there were 408 federal Indian boarding schools across 37 states and territories. And they identified either marked or unmarked burial sites at 53 of these. Realistically, this number is nothing. I'm sure every single boarding school has burial sites for children. And there have been no archaeological initiatives started. There are private ones happening with universities. I'm very proud to say that my university, my professor that I work with is going to be doing this summer. He's going to be working in Arizona at a site. But beyond that, beyond the private sector, beyond the university sector, the government is doing nothing. They are creating these initiatives, putting billions of dollars into them to work on discussion. Basically, they're like, we'll talk about it, we'll acknowledge it happened, but we're not going to actually help provide these children with the burials they deserve and the returning to their culture that is their identity. So somehow we are still managing, in America at least, to not help these children. We are still doing them injustice. We are still failing them as a society. And I just wanted to end my section with this quote. And I have the link for the citation, but it took Europeans, disease, guns, and horses less than 300 years to destroy a way of life that had been going on for at least 20,000 years. Although many Native American groups are trying to regain their cultural identity, it will never be the same. And unless America, and Canada's starting, but unless we really as a world, not just within the United States, take the initiative to fix this and to allow their reburials of these children and to work with Indigenous people. And this is why it is so important within archaeology, within history, within any sort of, group that can help to work with community partners, to work with Indigenous tribes and not just take over their land. And I mean, this goes beyond just like culturally, this is also great for the ecology. I mean, look at like if we used cultural burning in California, for example, like it would help a lot of the ecological situation. The Indigenous people that lived on this land know this land better than any of us could ever understand it. And yet we continue to minimize their voices, to literally kill them, and they're suffering to this day from it. For that, I will pass it over to Sofia to give her section of the presentation. Oh, do we have a question? Yeah. Yeah, Mom, you want to ask a question?
No, actually, I wanted to say we have a couple more people that have joined, including Yusuf from Egypt. And I just wanted to thank him for in the middle of the night there. Hi, Yusuf. Where is he? Wait.
He fell asleep. Hopefully not.
Oh no, I'm here.
Hi.
Can't see it.
Yes, give me a moment.
What time is it there?
It's 12:40 actually.
Oh. Well, we're glad you could join us. And hi, Abby.
You can see me now?
Yes, hello.
Yeah, hi.
Hey.
Anyway, I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew you were here. And
Thank you.
Abby. Sorry for the interruption, Juliette.
No, you're good.
Should
All
I
right,
stop for a little discussion or should I just keep forge ahead?
just forge ahead. I
Okay, forging ahead.
think.
All right, so let's move. Oh, something happened.
I'm sorry. I hit the button.
Okay. Okay, so this is the ongoing implications section. This is just a photo from the Ohlone tribe, which again is native to the East Bay, where Berkeley is in California, just at a community organizing event. But just kind of to start off by saying that Indigenous people are still here. They are very present in our communities. They're present in their own communities. They were not wiped out by colonization. They're still here. Their traditions are very alive and well. So with that, okay. So this is kind of a discussion question, kind of me just talking about it. But I wanted to say, what does it mean to say we are in a post-colonial era? Because a lot of what Juliette was discussing was during the colonial era or the period of active colonization. But I just kind of wanted to open it up to ask people's thoughts on what they think it means to say that we are in a post-colonial era, what they think of that, whether we think that colonization can end, I guess.
And feel free to raise your hand or just talk. You can unmute yourself. Looking at the bird. Oh, Allie, please.
Well, I can say a little bit from my English perspective, where post-colonial tends to be seen as in the literary turn of it, seen as an era that, oh, I don't know if I would say maybe from like the 80s onwards. I'm not entirely sure about that. I'm thinking kind of like since the Queen was alive, but like only by a bit. Here in England, people like to think of the Queen's life as kind of the end of the colonial era. Yeah, it was talked a lot about when she died, but in literature, it tends to be an era that is marked by a lot of kind of postmodernist styles of writing and divesting from sort of normal, I'll put that in scare quotes, European styles like the novel as we know it. And it also features a lot more diversity of thought and background in authors that are being canonized now. So being accepted kind of as worthy of academic study. Canonized is just a fancy way of saying that. But as far as if we're actually post-colonial, I would say we're not. I mean, Puerto Rico is, an epitome of, and DC for that matter, taxation without representations on their license plate for DC, not to mention Guam and all the other territories the US has. And the UK is just as bad. They've got a bunch of random islands that are just, UK territories and stuff. And I think a lot of the European countries also have them. But, I don't know that I have a broader concept of what that means for the future. That's just kind of what I think of it for now.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I can speak
Oh,
from
sure.
a infrastructure perspective. A lot of what we discuss in my civil engineering classes is addressing infrastructure problems. And a lot of what I realized is that our infrastructure issues very disproportionately affect members of marginalized communities, especially Indigenous communities. And those are the areas that we talk about in my climate change mitigation classes that are going to be hit the hardest. So even though the United States and England may not be actively still claiming territories, there is still a general attitude of, well, these well-off areas are going to be fine. The poor and Indigenous areas will let them fend for themselves, and we'll focus on fixing the infrastructure in other areas. So there's still very much an inequitable attitude towards infrastructure planning.
Interesting.
I think like colonization, in the way.
Sorry.
Sorry. I think colonization, the way that we see it in our present and the way it manifests itself now, past the physical or manifestations of what it was and how you were saying, like, those acts of violence and what they brought to the Americas. What we see now is just, like you were saying, a mindset and a colonized way of thinking. These epistemologies that came from Europe and the Western world are still here. So post-colonial era would be when Indigenous epistemologies and Indigenous ways of life and thinking are recognized for what they are, which is like a fully valid and extremely advanced way of thinking, instead of seeing them as savage and as old-timey, just things that weren't Western. So because of that, we'll always be in the colonial era until we learn to recognize ways of thinking and ways of lives that aren't Western and the value that they have.
Okay, thank you. That was all great. I loved hearing from like the individual specialties, but also that was kind of what we were getting at, just when we really think about the fact that we say we are in a post-colonial era, yet all around us are the ongoing effects of colonization. Can we really say that just, I don't even know if we can say that we're out of active colonization even so. So just to keep in mind whenever anyone is talking about colonization being a thing of the past, it's very much still here and still affecting people's daily lives. So with that, move on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some specific policies that are still affecting people to this day surrounding Indian sovereignty. So, and a lot of the terminology in this section will be referring to Indigenous people as Indian, just because at the time that a lot of these rules and regulations and everything was happening or were into place, the common term from the government standpoint was Indian. So the Indian Child Welfare Act is something that's being talked about a lot right now. I'm not sure if anyone else has heard about the Supreme Court revisiting the Indian Child Welfare Act, but basically what's happening, well, here's a little background. I'll read this quote. About a third of Native children were adopted away through child welfare agency actions, says Chuck Hoskin Jr., the chief of the Cherokee Nation. And of that group, about 85% were adopted outside of tribal families. The tribe saw these actions as a threat to their very existence, and Congress agreed. So in response, they passed the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, also known as the ICWA. So talking about the boarding schools and also just like adoption outside of tribal communities, with the forced Christianization and just like the forced assimilation of Indigenous people into Anglo-American society, into speaking English, into giving up traditions, there was a lot going on basically from every direction, trying to remove the next generations of Indigenous people, as in their children, from their cultures to effectively erase the remainder of their cultures, and so that they would not carry it on into their adult lives, and they would essentially assimilate into what the government saw as good society. So this is just a part of that, basically, where Indigenous groups, appealed with the government and said 85% of the third of Native children who are adopted are being moved into predominantly white families. And this was also an issue because the field of social work, which we now know differently today, although there's still a lot of issues, but at the time was primarily white women going into Indigenous communities to remove Indigenous children from their homes, which is also why the current field of social work has so many issues going on with related to, ethically dealing with children in those in bad situations. But yeah, so that's kind of where the Indian Child Welfare Act came about, which was spurned by, as you can see, the Indigenous communities themselves. But it has been brought back to light very recently in 2022 because the Supreme Court was decided to revisit the ICWA, which naturally spurned a lot of fear from Indigenous communities because, as we know, the Supreme Court recently has been making some sporadic decisions. So at any moment, they were worried that they could strike down even more of their rights. So basically what happened, there's a ton of cases being added, specific cases being added to the Supreme Court case that they're looking at. But one that I wanted to highlight was a family in Texas that is seeking to adopt the half-sister of their previously adopted son, who are both Native. but they're being challenged by the child's tribe, the Navajo, or the Diné. And briefly, I will just say that in talking about using correct naming for the tribes, Navajo was actually the name given to or forced upon the Diné tribe. And Navajo, it's kind of disputed on what the meaning is, but it's thought to have been given by Spanish settlers either to mean knife, as in like a warrior context or a savage context, maybe just like land, like a general term for dry land, or another one that I can't remember. But basically, just that is not what they call themselves or would prefer to be called. And Navajo or Diné is one of the largest reservations and continued legacies of Indigenous people in the US. So that's a good one to remember if you're going to remember any. So this family in Texas, a lot of what they're complaining or raising to the courts is that the ICWA removes individualized assessment from deciding where to place a child, because this child that they're trying to adopt has been put into the foster care system. But what the tribe is saying, what the Diné are saying, is that individualized assessment must include, quote, the child's relationship with her relatives, her language, her religion, and her tribal tradition. So it's not necessarily a situation of this individual family is bad or they have bad intentions. Their intention is, in their minds, is to reunite this sister with the brother that they had previously adopted. But the tribe, which is currently responsible for the child, is basically saying, we would like to keep her with us, because though the brother does not have the chance to be a part of our community, be raised in our community because he was already adopted, we would not like the same to happen to the child, the daughter. So there, oh wait, I didn't mean to move on yet, but there we go. So there actually has not been they've not come to a decision yet, I'm pretty sure, based on the fact that I could not find one. But they're continuously adding new cases. It's really interesting if you look it up. There's a ton of like just individual stories in there of either people that were adopted into white or non-Indigenous families, or ongoing legal battles with adoption. And again, it's not, a lot of these cases are not necessarily like saying that the families that are trying to adopt are bad or that the people that are protesting are bad. More just, it's good to think about when these things are brought up in the Supreme Court, in the highest court of the land that has a lot of power to give and take away in terms of sovereignty and rights. Just like acknowledging the fears that Indigenous people have when this does come up, because yeah, I mean, to be frank, the government hasn't ever done much good in their communities. So they're probably not likely to see any of these things as something that would help them. Okay, so then I want to talk a little bit about conditions of reservations or Indigenous peoples' reservations. So here's a quote here: Indigenous reservations are created in one of three ways: by treaty, by executive order of the president, or by an act of Congress. So notably here, just basically not by decision of the Indigenous groups who are living on the reservations. So a little bit of background information. It's a little scattered. I'm kind of just giving general image of life on reservations. But there's approximately 576 federally recognized tribes in the US, and there's 326 reservations, which can span either from 16 million acres, which is the largest, which is the Diné reservation, to 1.32 acres, which is a cemetery of the Pit River tribe. And reservations are either what is remaining of territory after land was forcibly taken by European and American governments, or land that the government basically assigned to people when they were forcibly resettled. So it can either be remnants of ancestral land, or it can be just completely random places where they were pushed that they had to then make theirs, but it is not their ancestral land. And reservations are generally exempt from state jurisdiction, though Congress still has jurisdiction in certain cases. just pointing out that this is sovereign by colonizer standards. So before colonization, tribes did not need to be sovereign because there was no sense of, I guess, ownership over land, or there was obviously governments. They were sovereign by their standards. Now they are sovereign by colonizer standards. A little more background information. Life on reservations does not tend to be great, as you can imagine, if just based on the way that they were originated. But as of 2020, one out of 3 Indigenous people are living in poverty, and not all Indigenous people live on reservations. It's actually between 20 and 40, I can't remember, 20 and 40% of Indigenous people that live on reservations currently. But a lot of that is due to the fact that a lot of tribes are not federally recognized. I mean, when I said there's 526 federally recognized tribes, and then we think back to the map that Juliette showed us with, an entire continent filled with barely any space in between of different tribes. There are a lot that are not federally recognized, and that actually gets in the way of a lot of communities being able to have reservation or land that is on which they would be sovereign. Economic opportunities beyond casino tourism and government positions are low on most reservations, which is why poverty is so high. And there are extremely high rates of violence against women, often at the hands of seasonal laborers in gas and oil industries who set up camps in rural areas near reservations, and hundreds of cases per year go unprosecuted. So it's basically, I think there's generally a sense of being abandoned on reservations. Their means of self-sufficiency were stripped, and then they were either given leftover, not given, forced onto leftover land, or just forced onto entirely new land that they had no connection with. There's really high rates of depression as well among Indigenous communities on reservations and off of reservations, as you can imagine, just based off of everything that we're talking about. Hold on, just do slideshow again. Sorry, quick refresh. Okay, this is my last slide. I'm gonna talk a little, just minus it. It's fine, I don't need to see. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the land back movement. Can I have a show of hands of who knows what the land back movement is? Okay, interesting, thank you. So I will try and do a decent job of explaining it. So this is just a good place to start. It's a quote by, if you look up land back movement, this is like one of the first websites that pops up. It's organized by Indigenous activists. But it says, land back is more than just a campaign. It is a political framework that allows us to deepen our relationships across the field of organizing movements, working towards true collective liberation. It allows us to envision a world where Black, Indigenous, and POC liberation coexist. It is our political organizing and narrative framework from which we do work. So that's a lot of words. But basically, land back is the movement for Indigenous people to reclaim land. And there's a ton of avenues through which this is happening. There's instances where they are raising money to literally buy land back from the government and making it Indigenous land. There are cases of people giving back land, so people who may own land who are not Indigenous but have a connection with the tribe, or just don't, basically who want to give the land back, will, maybe you could say donate, but give back the land to the Indigenous tribes of that area. Sappho's trying to escape. But yeah, there's a ton of different avenues through which this is happening. Basically everything that they can think of that would work to get as much land back as possible. There's actually a movement going on in Berkeley right now about that with the Ohlone in Emeryville. Emeryville is a city that's right next to Berkeley, so like 15 minutes away. But it's very interesting because a ton of streets in Emeryville and everywhere, but in Emeryville specifically, are named after Indigenous people, yet Indigenous people of the area that are in tribes that are not federally recognized are struggling to get land back in that area where the names of their cultural traditions are being used everywhere on street signs. yet they are not federally recognized and they cannot, they don't have access to the land to be sovereign on. I don't have much else to say off the top of my head about this, but it is very interesting. I highly recommend you look into it. And wherever you can support, please do. There's lots of ways for people to get involved in supporting Indigenous people getting land back.
Yeah.
The end.
So yeah, I think we would just love to open it up to discussion. If anyone has any questions before we do discussion, let us know.
Yes, any clarifying
I can
questions
go back to
or
that
anything?
map, maybe.
Yeah.
Juliette, can you put
Yes.
it back where we're looking at everybody?
Oh, yes, I can do that too.
Perfect.
Make it big.
Well, I can make a comment, if I may.
Please.
I grew up, I don't know if Jenna is still with us, but I grew up, in California, and literally as a kid, I remember going to school with Indians, Indigenous people, but then we called them Indians.
Mhm.
And they were my friends. And I mean, I remember going up and we would drive like to Arizona and Oklahoma to see family through California. And you would literally legit pass tribes. You would see the teepees, and this sounds like something you'd see in a Western movie, but for real, like growing up, that's what was out there. And that's what and I never thought, personally, me and my friends never saw them as being different. But as you guys all know, I grew up with a variety of races. And so I kind of never really saw people as different because of their skin color or whatever. But it's really, I think this is a really powerful thing to talk about, because especially for me, because I grew up with them and seeing them in their tribes and seeing them in school and the way they were and the way they looked. And then through the years, they just, I know this sounds really awful, but they all just sort of disappeared. And one thing you didn't touch upon, which I know is true, in addition to all the negative things that happen to them because of our government and everything, but there's a huge, huge problem with alcoholism in Indian tribes today and outside the tribes as well. I'm not sure why, but that's really prevalent. Anyway, I just think that your presentation was brilliant, and I'm glad that you guys touched upon it, and I think it's important. And I am aware of the land back thing. I wish it would happen more, but I don't know. I feel like our government really doesn't care in the scheme
They
of
don't.
things.
Yeah, which is why with land back, it's cool that it's like a mutual aid Indigenous led project where they're basically saying, okay, no one else is doing anything. We are going to try every avenue we can to reclaim sovereignty. So yeah.
I will say one more thing that's kind of sad, which this may not, I don't even know if it makes sense, but there was the way they looked growing up. And over time that changed. And now, even now, when I go back home and I see people that I know that are definitely Indian, they definitely don't use the word whitewashed, but they definitely look more white. The way they dress, the way they wear their hair, as opposed to the way it used to be when I was young. Does that make sense?
More colonized.
Yeah,
Exactly.
actually,
Articulating it very well, but yeah.
yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about the blood quantum idea?
Yeah, you go for it.
Okay. So I don't know if that necessarily has to do with this, but there's also kind of something that's being discussed right now, which is the harms of blood quantum and thinking about how much Indigenous blood someone has. I don't know a ton about it, so I'm not going to try and speak super in depth on it, but it's basically the idea that due to colonization, obviously there is a ton of different ethnicities within Indigenous people. It's very rare, honestly, to find anyone who is at this point who is not a blend of many different ethnicities. And it's kind of the idea that it's harmful to say that if someone, to decide someone's level of indigeneity based off of blood quantum, because if someone is connected with the culture and even just invested in their Indigenous community, they are Indigenous. And, it's, yeah, I don't know a ton about it, but that's just basically the idea of that. Does anyone else know more about the blood quantum idea?
Yeah.
I actually,
Amy will speak.
so helping out with like the whole idea of blood quantum, on certain tribal cards, a lot of Indigenous people, in order to be allowed to like carry the name Indigenous, have to be federally recognized and personally like vetted as an individual, and in which some tribes, as given by the government or themselves, require a certain percentage of Indigenous blood within your lineage, whether it's a direct parent, both parents, or grandparents, great grandparents. And this idea is used to diminish like Indigenous like communities like today, and saying that, oh, you know, that's a thing of the past. You are 1/16, which I believe, if I did the math right, means you had a great grandparent, right, who was Indigenous, and by using these numbers, saying that the culture can't stay alive because you don't have the permission or the consent of the government or an Indigenous group to practice the culture.
You want to say anything?
Are you, I don't want to go off in any way. I was going to say my great grandfather was born on Cherokee land. He was Cherokee, and my mother actually had to go to what Oklahoma called Indian school, because if you were 1/16 or more Native, you had to be taken out of school in elementary school to go to this special class where you were re-educated. And essentially, it wasn't in any way to the same degree of boarding schools at that point. She was allowed to go back home to her family, but there was still very much this idea of if you were a certain amount of Native, they needed to make sure that you knew that was not going to be what you carried on.
And that was your mother?
Re-educated on. That was my.
So what year?
So this would have been, this would have been like 1975, 1976.
I think that's something that we forget too, like, is how recent all of this has been happening. Like, of course, like colonization and all of that, you know, started with Columbus, and, you know, that was like the bad period of like genocide. But we forget that how recently, I mean, it's only been recent that America has even like, as a society, started to think of Indigenous people as Indigenous to America. I feel like we kind of like separated them as like such a not a part of our civilization, not a part of our society. And it's only been, I feel like, relatively recent that we've sort of allowed the integration, and at like the most basic level of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Allie.
I have kind of a not as academic comment on this topic, which is about like appropriation of art and stuff. And I remember a couple years ago, I think maybe it was around when Canada was discovering like all these bodies of school children. So I guess that was like what, 2020, 2019, sometime around then. Yeah. Before Twitter became awful like it is now, I used to love Twitter, and I followed like a lot of Native people, a lot of Indigenous people. And one thing they were saying is like, hey, really easy way to help out Indigenous people is to buy art earrings. Like if you want beadwork, which is like really pretty and fun, just to actually buy from Indigenous people, not from people posing as Indigenous or creating Indigenous art who don't know the significance of it. And obviously with every cultural appropriation conversation, there are discussions to be had about like gatekeeping and stuff like that. But this wasn't necessarily, the people posting this weren't saying don't buy from other people. They're just saying, hey, this is my culture, this is my heritage, this is my art, please buy some. I have some really nice earrings I bought over Twitter from that time that are like the same price as if you went to Francesca's. So you might as well buy them. But another thing I remember is a few years ago, ColourPop, which is a makeup brand that's well known for their eyeshadow palettes, did a like tribal themed palette and like set, and it very quickly got a lot of backlash because it was just totally plucking symbols from different tribes of Indigenous people in the States and using them for the marketing and the, you know, and of course it was like, I mean, it wasn't trying to be savage like the earlier drawings of Native Americans, but it was not good. And they got a lot of they got so much backlash actually that they dropped the palette, they discontinued it. I don't remember if they did a statement or not. I kind of didn't follow it. And to be fair, ColourPop is one of the only like cruelty-free companies that makes decent eyeshadow that stays on your face. I was glad they listened and dropped it, but it was one of those interesting things where people actually kicked up enough of a fuss that they said, oh, you know what? Maybe we should hire more diverse staff to think about these things before we produce them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that does bring up just the importance of like purchasing from Indigenous and, you know, BIPOC, like in general peoples, instead of just purchasing from like corporations, especially when I was in Miami with Alex, we went to like this tribal, what was it? It was like just like a celebration, and they had a lot of like local like Indigenous people. And oh yeah, we should explain. BIPOC is Black Indigenous People of Color, so just any non-white person basically. But just supporting like Indigenous and Black artists is super fundamental to helping them survive and helping them like continue. And
And I think also me and Juliette were actually talking about this the other day, and I'm sure you guys know as well, like talking about how white American culture has like a simultaneous like disgust and reverence for like Black and Indigenous cultures. Like for example, where they would try and sell a tribal palette because the aesthetics of it are like interesting to them, yet they're not. Was any of the money for that, sounds like a horrible idea,
No.
going to go into like helping Indigenous people or anything like that? You know, we're like,
Yeah.
we're just
None of it
which is
was.
appropriate, which is appropriation, like you were saying, where we're profiting off of their ideas and their culture and everything without giving anything back or consulting them in the first place.
yeah, and one thing I would add too is if you look at a lot of like classical or neoclassical monuments, and like especially within the capital in DC, just kind of throughout DC, there's a lot of the like savage Indian princess tropes throughout like paintings, and like even in the capital. Like if you, I mean, not that any of us are, I guess the Pickens might go to DC. If you go to the DC and you go to the Capitol or you go anywhere in there and you look at the artwork on the walls, you'll find these very distinctive like Indigenous drawing or white drawings of Indigenous people that are just like absolutely horrifying. And you know, just the tropes, and it's just it's scary to think that like in the modern age, like these paintings, you know, were made in like the 1700s, 1800s, and yet we still have them on the walls, and yet they're still very prevalent, they're still there, and no one's thought to like get them redone by an actual Indigenous painter. And if you also just think about like in America, like we put so much effort in like art with using Greco-Roman motifs or like literally anything except for Indigenous drawings, which is just something to kind of think about in your daily life. Yeah, Tori, please.
First of all, I think you guys did an amazing job on this presentation, bringing a lot of great information to light. I don't have much to add because I'm definitely not educated in the indigenous people's history. I mean, obviously we all know the basic history, but I don't know much detail. I just want to veer off a little bit to the cultural appropriation discussion. As a musician who has studied flamenco guitar, which is an art of Spain. I'm not from Spain. I'm an Israeli guy, and I love that art. I perform that art and everything else. I've never contributed, money or anything necessarily to Spain. But that doesn't mean, you know what I mean? You could create art, you can play the blues, which that's a whole other discussion because, people think blues as a Black art, where you can see a lot of similarities to what Native Americans were doing with their music, that blues was actually very, but not to get too deep into it, I'm just saying not everything has to be looked at in a negative way of, oh, we're using this culture, we're taking advantage. You know what I'm saying? If an artist is inspired by a culture to create earrings or to create home decor like pillows or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean, that they're exploiting the culture. You know what I mean? It could also mean that they appreciate that art form. It touches them in a certain way, and they want to recreate something that the rest of society might actually enjoy, and maybe even get inspired, you know, to go and study it further.
Like Allie raised her hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Dory, what you're describing is the difference between cultural appreciation and appropriation. So you're describing appreciation, which is like, hey, I love this culture. I want to participate in this culture because it's beautiful. Whereas appropriation, like ColourPop, the company I'm talking about, is this huge conglomerate that is picking and choosing from different diverse cultures without knowing anything about them, without caring, only thinking about the money. And that's the difference. It's not about love or appreciation. It's about profit at the expense of a culture they don't understand. But you're describing something that's, you know, diving into the culture, appreciating it, loving it, contributing in it, participating in it, which, as you said, it is a positive thing. It's just, it's separate. And I guess another difference is Spanish people in Spain are not a persecuted peoples. If anything, in history, they've been the opposite most of the time. So it's very different. It's not really the same kind of thing, because in your example, you're someone who has not had any negative, your people have not had any negative, as far as I'm aware, impact. You haven't committed genocide on Spanish people, but we as a white American, my people have committed genocide on Native American people. So if I started a business and made $1 billion selling Native American art, it's probably unethical compared to me sponsoring a Native American artist, working with them perhaps to create, you know, use my business skills and their art, their culture to make that money, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They might have y'all might have more insight. That's just kind of my thinking.
No, that's a great discussion.
Yeah, it was a great description.
One thing I did, if I may, I just wanted to show this because I'll put it in the drive, but while I was looking at those maps and stuff, I found this great resource here that has, it's not the best document, like just organization wise, but it provides like a list of, it's a pronunciation guide. It has tribal map spreadsheet with the tribal names, their indigenous given name, which is this column here, and then the translation based off on whatever translations they have, and then the given name by colonizers and the translation of that. So for example, oh, it was a good one. There's one I thought was interesting. It was oh no, I can't find it. I don't know, you can kind of look through it, but here it is. The Tataviam, their name means people facing the sun. And then the given name was Fernandino, which is just people of San Fernando. And just things like that. It's just interesting to learn about these different names and learn about what they actually would have been and what they would have meant. Of course, there's not pronunciation guides for all of them, but like Ohlone is cool because it's the same given name as the indigenous name, which is awesome. But yeah, lots to look through here. Like a lot, like it's long. But if you have time and if you're interested, I'll definitely drop it in the drive, and I recommend you look through it because it's really cool. And it's the same person who made the map who is working on that. So it just proves that, I'll let you talk in 1 second, but it just proves that if you are interested in something and you want to help people and you are interested in making these maps, like the guy who made them is, I'm not going to speak on whether he's indigenous or not, but he's just a random guy who's like, I really like maps. And there's no maps of indigenous populations. And since then he's, gone forward with it. But yeah, Mom, what were you going to say? Or Alicia, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say we should all come up with names.
Names
You
for
know,
what?
girl who faces sun, something cool, an Indian name. They're so cool. Did you read them? They're
Yeah, you got to be cautious.
okay. I know. Back, it's fine. I meant that in a nice way. It's all good.
Yeah.
Well, I think that brings up something that I want to express about spending this time with all of you, and like Dory said, I'm learning a lot, and the information that has been brought forward has made me reflect. And I have to say that here in the Carolinas, for me, living here, where I was not born, I don't have the knowledge of the counties. I don't have the knowledge of the history, other than more of the slave, and the Black history has been more prominently discussed here, as opposed to the Indigenous, as far as Native American. Yet, as an Iowan, I was born and raised in Iowa, and when you had spoken about the land back, I didn't know that it was called that, but I've been reading about a lot of farmers in Iowa that have been participating in the land back program. I didn't realize that was what it was called, but I had been reading that they've been giving acreages of their home back to the Indigenous. And I also realized that growing up there, I didn't really realize it, but there are a lot of counties in Iowa that are Native American: Tama, Poweshiek, Appanoose. These were names, Tama, if I didn't say that already, that were part of my daily education of counties is what I'm saying, like how we each have a county. In that there are many of the counties in Iowa are named after Indigenous people. Yet, if I were to say, I wasn't really raised with any of them. Where I was raised was Des Moines, but all of these outlying Maquoketa, and then there's a gambling casino there. So this has brought up something in me of paying more attention to that, of maybe we could all take a look of where we live now, where we are born, the name of the counties and what's happening there. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to educate myself a little bit more around that, and also about colonization and what you spoke about that. It's very much alive. Like, let's look at all of the fracking that's going on in all of these counties, all of these people who are losing a part of their history, their burial grounds, with all of this fracking that's happening, is a huge other conversation that can be had. So I just want to thank you for bringing this to our attention more. I think it's a very important work. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I will say there's a concept I was introduced to recently by one of my classes, part of the land back movement, called a land tax. It is essentially donation that people can opt into to give to their local tribes as a thank you or apology for taking space upon their land. So I think that's a great way to get started, because once you learn, you got to put your money where your mouth is, So that's one way to mobilize.
That's really awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've imposed, capitalistic society, super hierarchical, run by the government and everything upon the Indigenous people. So now the best way to help is
to pay them.
like you said, put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, so you can probably look up your local tribe, and then typically the phrase is land tax, and you might be able to find a program set up in your area.
That's awesome. I have two things I'd like to just add. One is on Stephanie's note, I think it's super interesting to consider the difference between how the East Coast and the West Coast and Central Coast and all of that discusses Indigenous populations, because I feel like the East Coast has a lot less willingness to discuss it, just because the genocide that really occurred happened there. I mean, think about it. That's where the settlers came. That's where they really massacred people. Whereas it took a while not a while, but it took a little bit of time for them to then move to the West Coast and start continuing the massacre. And it's something that I agree with you. It's interesting because it's like so many genocides happened on the East Coast between slavery and between Indigenous populations that it's like, to some extent, I feel like Americans are far more willing to discuss the slavery side of that compared to the Indigenous side of that, just because it is more recent comparatively. And yet I like growing up in Georgia, I think about all of the different indigenous names that were surrounding me that I didn't even know, like the Okefenokee Swamp and like the can't even remember the river that we used to, Chattanooga River or whatever, Chatta something. Yeah, Chattahoochee. And these are things that like growing up I never recognized were indigenous. You kind of know, but like it's not something that like you don't have a class that's just let's talk about the indigenous land that we are on now. And I noticed in South Carolina, I mean, maybe it's just the time I moved there, but like there was never discussion about that. I mean, I didn't know who the indigenous people that lived in South Carolina were. Alia.
They did teach us that. They taught me. I mean, I remember every year, or at least every other year, we'd go and go to a reservation in northern Georgia with school.
I did it once.
I remember going a few times. I remember I got to pan for gold and stuff, and I got to see.
Well, that's different though, because that's like gold rush.
No, but I mean, in part of it is we got all the history of the northern Georgia. Maybe you were just too young to remember, and then you moved to South Carolina, and they don't teach none of that.
Yeah,
but my point learning that when we were little.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
well, I don't.
Hey, I just want to say something. Yusuf, are you still awake?
I'm here.
We're talking about something that you probably have no clue what we're discussing.
No, actually, let me add a little bit. I don't have much knowledge about it, but I remember during my exchange year, I went to visit New Mexico, and I visited Taos over there, and they had their little homes, and I remember visiting it, and I felt like it looked a little bit similar of a city in Egypt called Noba, which is basically they build their homes in a very similar shape, but and they kind of have same lifestyle, but still it exists till now. People live there normally. The only difference is that the homes are a little bit more colorful over here in Noba. But yeah, it was very interesting to go see their culture and how they live, and I even got to taste some of their food, and yeah, it was interesting to visit and see the culture.
That's really cool. Do you guys like in Egypt, is there a discussion of like indigenous populations at all? Like, do you guys like is that something that's talked about in your like academics?
No, not really. I don't think so, because here most of the people are basically Egyptians. There is no like any other culture that was in here. Maybe we had like a UK like holding over Egypt for like 70 years or something, but I don't think we talk about it a lot. They just added to our culture. Maybe a few from the words became an Arabic words, but other than that, not much happened to Egypt, I guess, because we just don't talk about it a lot.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
No, it did. It did. 100%. That's really cool.
Yeah. If anyone else, I was going to talk a little bit about the mission system.
Oh, please do. That's so interesting.
So just in Juliette and Allie talking about, education on the East Coast surrounding this, and I don't know where everyone else is originally from, but a lot of us here are from California, where we have something called the mission system. So California was colonized by the Spanish, which is why a ton of our city names are Spanish. Like a lot of anything with San that starts with San is Spanish, and a bunch of others. But so we have like how many missions are there? Yeah, something like in 20 something missions all along the coast of California. And that was basically forced Christianization sites where Spanish priests would basically enslave indigenous people at the missions. And a lot of people died there. A lot of people were forcibly assimilated there. Just sites of like general terror. And a huge part of elementary California education is the mission system. We talk about the fact that there were indigenous people there for sure, but I just like as you get older, you kind of, it's just a little bit weird, like how much we focus on the missions. And And I actually went to a Catholic high school called Mission. And we went to a mission for mass.
Wow.
And every time I was in there, I was just thinking about how many Indigenous people died there a couple centuries ago. So yeah, anyone else want to add to that?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Do you feel like, I mean, mission being bad, just
Yes.
to state it is a bad thing, but do you feel like having the missions and visiting them like allowed you to be more aware of the genocide that happened there, or like the, you know, the
Mhm.
impacts that happened on Indigenous people? Because like in the Southeast, we don't have anything like that at all.
Yeah.
The only thing we have is the land we stand on, and
Yeah.
you know, there is awareness, but like it's not something we're confronted with regularly.
Yeah, I think it did, but in a lot of respects, I think our education did not, at least for me, did not emphasize enough how they were sites of genocide. It was a lot of glorification of Spanish culture, or you know, the culture that was, you know, that created the missions, basically, not Spanish culture in general, but just like predatory Catholic culture. And yeah, it was. We talked a lot about like the fathers, you know, the Spanish priests, and just like what life was like at the missions. But I do not think that the fact that they were sites of genocide was emphasized very much. Anyone else want to add to that?
I can do.
I think
I
y'all
would
did
say-
a really good job of putting all this information together. This is really good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Juliette, I'm going to send you an article that, because one of the things that you know, we've always known that there's been some type of Native American on my side of the family. And so I'm going to send you an article that I found specifically talking about the ICWA.
Oh,
And,
cool. I'll send it to her too.
And if you want to distribute it, because I'll have everybody's email, so
Yes,
I'll send you.
please
And
do.
basically, I found out, you know, we always suspected there was Native American on my side of the family, but also there's African American on my side, on 164th,
interesting.
you know, Native American and 132nd African American. So
Interesting.
that was always, well, my mom and dad would always talk about it off to the side when no one else was around. You know, one of those things that back when I was growing up, you know, I didn't realize at that time, but you know, they didn't want me to know, and they didn't want other people around our neighbors to know, oh, maybe there's a Native American or African American in me. So
That's very interesting. That brings up something I'd love to talk about. Katie, what were you gonna say though? Sorry, I thought you had your.
lost it.
It's okay. I know you had your hand up. But yeah, I would love to just bring that up really quickly. Like, it's interesting because I feel like I've heard from a lot of people, and I also like from my own family, like a lot of white Americans have this, like, I feel like there's like almost like a folk tale in a lot of white American families where they're like, oh, we have Indigenous blood, and we have, you know, our grandmother walks the Trail of Tears, or our grandmother did this, that, or the other, or, you know, whatever it may be. And like my family has a lore like that. And I mean, I've done genetic testing and there's 0 Native American in me as of, you know, now, but I mean, the genetic testing, maybe I'll try another one. My mother has qualms with that. I'm just bringing this up, but it's not just something like I'm saying about myself. It's something I've heard from a lot of people. And I just wonder, like, what is it about? It's interesting that as white Americans, we kind of glorify that. And we're like, I mean, I'm not minimizing that. Like, if you do have it, that is something to be like, you know, that is part of your being, and that's a part of your identity, and that's awesome. But at the same time, it's like, it's funny that like so many white Americans who don't have any genetic testing that includes Native American in their DNA still have these lores and have these things in their families that's like down the ages. And yes, typically what that means is if you have Native American in your blood and you're very white, it probably means that there was some sort of rape that happened at some point. And that's something that I think about. And the same with like African American blood, and you like, it's the same idea, and yet we still glorify it. Yeah.
You're gonna have to help me out here because we haven't studied this since like sophomore year of high school. But there was also something called the Dawes Act of 1887 that delineated the rights of Indigenous Americans. And like, especially land use rights, like how they can hunt, how they can fish, and how they can practice
yes.
agriculture. But along, like, kind of a side piece of the Dawes Act was that almost anyone was able to essentially purchase a card saying that they were Native American and to assume that identity. And my sister and I discovered this actually happened in our family. Growing up, we also had that tale of like, we had, ignoring my Latin American side of the family for a second, that we had indigenous blood in it, that she was my great-great-grandmother who was a soothseeker named Bone Break. Following my grandma's passing, my sister and I were digging through documents and found that no, she was a German immigrant under the last name of Bone Brocken and assumed this identity through the Dawes Act.
That's so interesting.
So you could pay to be a native.
That's
You
crazy.
could, I didn't know that. That's actually crazy. But yeah, it's just something to think about. I know, Mom, you had something you wanted to say as well.
Sorry.
Maybe I did it. Maybe I misunderstood.
I actually, recently, a friend of ours, Beth, she has a very similar story to mine, where there was stories about, you know, having American Indian in her history, and same as you, somebody in her family took the test and said there's nothing. But the thing that I want to stress is not, I don't even know how to say this. My great uncle had an entire room full of Indian stuff and a homage to our ancestry. And my great grandma, I remember as a kid, long silver hair. She had the nose. I mean, I have stories upon stories upon stories, and then all of a sudden we do the DNA test and everything's like out the window. Same thing with my friend Beth. Almost same thing. Like, it was wild. We were talking the other night and I was like, are you kidding me? So could it be, I'm just throwing this out there, is possible that these DNA tests aren't so reliable? I don't know, you guys, I'm just saying.
well, Can I?
You're gonna have a stew of hands. Why don't we start with Allie?
I just have a very small correction. It wasn't out of the blue. I told you guys like 6 years ago, because I was really interested in ancestry, tracing it back, and Nana had told us these stories. I had looked at census records. The grandmother you're talking about in the census, in every census, and all of her parents and grandparents are all white. And I looked everywhere. I looked in every document I could find. So it's not out of the blue. It's not necessarily like there's more evidence against it than there is for. Anyways, I don't know.
And I'll add and then I'll go through the list. I think the thing, like, especially from an anthropological perspective, I think the thing that a lot of people who have these lores in their family and who do the DNA test, regardless of DNA tests, I'm not going to comment on that because I don't know the science. I think they're pretty accurate, but I don't know it well enough to like be able to comment on it. But you need to start, I think the thing that we need to rethink about is not questioning the science, but questioning the people. Questioning, okay, why, even if it's supposedly an ancestry thing, if you are a white man and in the family, why are you keeping a room full of Native American lore that isn't yours? Why are you thinking it's okay to keep these things? And I'm not commenting. I would say this about any white man who does this. Like, this is not about the family. This is just in general. Like, it's okay to like appreciate a culture, but you have to recognize that like there's a difference, like we said, a difference between appreciation and appropriation. And there's a difference between like, it's the same as like repatriation of artifacts, you know, like we as Americans, like, and this happens with a lot of other cultures. Like, I mean, you could say the same about like how some white Americans are obsessed with like manga, obsessed with like, you know, all these different cultures. Like it's this obsession that happens that I think is truly, you can like trace it back just from like art and from history back to like colonization. I don't want to explain that. But it's interesting that like it's an obsession. It's like it's an appropriation and it's like, I think Americans, like we're very white and that's okay. Like, it's okay to have that. It's because like, I think there's also a jealousy associated. Cause like, if you look at indigenous culture, if you look at Japanese culture, if you look at all these different cultures, like they have such intense, deep rooted, like cultural beliefs and norms. And like, that is something that like white Americans don't really have unless it's like freedom and yeehaw, and which isn't, you know, that's not that beautiful. Like, I think there is a level of jealousy that like permeates deep into like the subconscious. And that's at least my kind of thoughts on it, but I don't want to take up too much time. So Amy, I saw you, or you're true. Yeah, go ahead.
So the way that these DNA tests work is that they get a full analysis and write it out. However, I don't do biology, right? And then people self-proclaim what they are, right? And then they start coupling these common genetic traits within people and saying like, okay, this trait belongs to Germans, this trait belongs to Native Americans from this region, right? So as time goes on, they are slowly getting more accurate, but genetics isn't, it doesn't work in the way that we are taught like in high school biology with the cute little Punnett squares and that you're 50-50. It just doesn't work that way. And with these genetic testings, because I did mine a couple of years back, I've noticed that my Indigenous portion is slowly growing as they collect more data from my community. That being said, a lot of Indigenous people absolutely do not want to even touch these genetic testing because that can open the door for all sorts of wacky legislation that bars them from their culture if by any chance they are too small of a percentage, you know, to claim their culture.
That's a very good point. Sorry.
Yeah. That article that I sent you, Juliette, that speaks a lot to that.
Yeah. And then I know Jackie and Katie, one of you who would, sorry, I saw hands. Or Davey, I don't know.
I was just gonna say.
Go ahead.
My family obviously has one specific person that we know was born on reservation, undeniably. However, when my grandmother, who was the the daughter of my great grandfather, did a 23andMe, should have shown up 50% Native, came up 0. So we are absolutely certain that Grandma Hazel was just having fun on the side and that my grandmother is not hers. And that made me think about record keeping back in other days. My grandfather also found out that his dad went to war, got syphilis, became infertile, came back, and then he was conceived magically. So it makes me wonder what women who didn't have many options in terms of leaving their husband from a financial standpoint, you know, if there were maybe other discrepancies in the ancestry line that way, that are just not well recorded.
That's very important thing to talk about, especially if you consider like the amount of women in Indigenous cultures and within the boarding schools. Like I mentioned that quote, like so many women were raped and like mistreated, and it makes sense to think about it. So Mom, maybe, but doubtful, but maybe. And then Jackie, you have something to say?
Not really.
Oh,
It
sorry.
did remind me of the story of how many or the way I came across the story was about Black people specifically, and it was how a lot of people who would pass would leave their lives and become orphans and go to a place where they could live as a white person, or pass as a white person and live their entire lives assuming that identity. And I'm not saying that that's what happened, but you know, there's just a lot of circumstances in which you may benefit from assuming an identity, whether that be for inspiration or wanting to be a little spicy.
Yeah, and it's funny because it reminds me in high school there's this one girl. I'll name her because only Mom and Allie. Chloe, you remember Chloe? She used to be like obsessed with the fact that she had like the most minimum amount of Native American you could have to get like, you know, get the benefits from it. And that was like something she like took as a cultural identity when she was very white. You know, she was white. She's a white woman, I would consider it. And she did nothing to look into her culture. She didn't know any background with any of that information. And it's interesting how like white people who have that like tiny percentage, they're so excited to be able to like be like, oh my God, I can take that and use what I can get from it. And yet they're not willing to do the hard work of like learning about the culture, learning about like who was it that had that percentage, did that person have it, like what's the background with that. And like I think this is something that is just important to kind of consider, like if you are a white person or mainly white looking or white perceiving or whatever, just to think about like how the impact of what you identify as and how you look. And I mean, of course, I didn't take your identity, like your identity is your identity. That's very important, but it's also important to acknowledge that like, if you are white passing, you have a privilege that other people do not have.
Who's there first?
Yeah, Story, please.
Just have a quick note, taking away, again, sort of fast forward into our modern society today, that it seems to me as somebody who is, you know, foreign looking, and I've been living in the US for, you know, 30 years at this point, that the more we try to define like what culture you are or whatever, we're also creating and maintaining a separation between the cultures. So in other words, the more we define, you know, you're this or you're that, and we need to respect that, and we need to respect that, the more we're creating division within the society also. So the dialogue has to be done, and you know, of course, I'm experiencing it myself. So the dialogue has to be done in a way that is not also singling out, you know, okay, well, you're this, and because you're this, you know, you have these problems. You're this because these you're, you know, and it's all because of the white. You know, it's not always all because of the white person. Like, you know, there's some things that people, you know, who are, you know, take for example, you know, myself being a relatively recent immigrant to the U.S. Okay, 30 years in the U.S. is recent. You know, I could have kind of like taken the, you know, the victim route of, you know, I'm discriminated against and I'm looked as a foreigner and my accent is not perfect and blah, blah, blah. And then said, oh, you know, because of this, I'm not successful, or because of this, you know, I can't, you know, achieve my goals or whatever. So, you know, I feel like there's always this delicate balance that has to be between acknowledging somebody who is from another culture, let's say not white or mixed or whatever, and also sort of understanding how do you integrate into the society that we're in currently, you know, and it just, it kind of bugs me a lot of times when we over and again, I'm not saying specifically to your discussion for, you know, in particular cases where, of course, you know, everything you talked about, but are we over victimizing sometimes and allowing a problem to persist, you know, that could potentially also be a little bit, I should say, at least a little bit improved, you know, from what it is today. You know, and that's just, you know, my perspective.
Yeah,
You know,
it's a good
so
discussion.
cultural sensitivity, you know, we're lacking cultural sensitivity for sure. You know, I think in the US and in Europe, mainly, and, you know, governments have been issuing warnings, you know, to these countries that discrimination against, you know, Muslims or, you know, anybody who doesn't look, you know, local, you know, can, you know, be hated upon. So we are lacking the cultural sensitivity, but at the same time, I feel like we also have to not overly divide and label culture, you know, people who are, you know, in different cultures, you know, in our discussions.
Yeah, that's a very good.
Yeah, I think there's a fine line between condescension, especially from like a government standpoint, and listening to people's lived experiences. So it's just, yeah, but yeah.
Hey,
Did you want-
Abby, what do you think?
Who?
Oh,
On this topic or just generally?
I
Just
think
generally.
just in general.
Okay, cool. Because I'm not too sure. I think that's a really interesting point brought up by Dory. But the one thing that I did want to say, and hello to everyone. I know I joined a little bit late. I'm Abby, and I'm one of Allie's friends from college. The one thing that I just wanted to like call out that I thought was a really important point that you brought up, Juliette, in the presentation, and I've been learning about a little bit more recently, was like the ecological side of things, moving away from all of the like sociological and like cultural, like there's so many aspects to this conversation that need to be had. But my sister studied environmental science and she's about to go to grad school for like conservation biology, and we had a conversation recently because I was reading the book, which I'm sure probably a lot of you guys know or have read, Braiding Sweetgrass. I know it's a pretty popular book, but it's all, you know, written by an Indigenous author and talking a lot about like Indigenous wisdom and kind of aligning that with science, and just lots of different good stuff in there. And my sister was talking about how much that was referenced in her like environmental science courses, which I never really talked about before. So it's just something that I think is so important in, you know, climate conversations and, having all of these discussions being informed by, as you said, Juliette, like the people who know the land and work here, they know it better than so many others. So yeah, I think that is super important, and really appreciate you guys bringing that up. Also, a random note, just thank you guys for bringing up and talking about the mission system, because I was just reading an article about it. I'm from upstate New York originally, but I've been spending time out in California a lot because my boyfriend actually lives in San Francisco, and going to the Mission District a lot, and like Dolores Park, like I like kind of knew a little bit about like the Spanish colonization, but like not in depth. So just thanks for bringing that up, because I want to educate myself a lot more on that, specifically having spent some time out in California in the past year or two.
Oh yeah.
Next time you're in San Francisco, let me know, Abby.
But yeah, the mission system is definitely a rabbit hole. So I hope you learn a lot. But yeah.
I actually was gonna ask Alex, I know you wrote an article about Indigenous perspectives with cultural burning. Would you want to talk about that a tiny bit?
Sure. I mean, I didn't write it from an Indigenous
I know, but you
perspective,
talked about the
obviously.
importance of, right? Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think just Indigenous people were much better at managing the lands than an extractive capitalist system that views resources as things to be used as inputs for a system that is supposed to output as much profit as possible. Because Indigenous people's mindset was inherently like oriented on kind of taking care of the land. It was more of like a stewardship mentality than a like owner and exploitative mindset. So yeah, I think there's like a lot to be learned from, in California specifically, how to manage forests using fire. Like when Anglo-American settlers came to California, they just like saw these like fires on these lands that they considered theirs and kind of freaked out. So they implemented like the park, not the park ranger system specifically, or maybe like the national park system was very involved in like fire suppression for a long time, like Smokey the Bear and all that, like only you can stop wildfires crap. And they like developed a zero tolerance policy towards any sort of fire, even though from an ecological perspective, like the forests in California and much of the West and even the Southeast have evolved for millions of years to kind of depend on seasonal fires for rejuvenation. It would like clear the underbrush, it would keep trees from growing too closely together. The ashes of the fire create extremely fertile soils. Some trees actually depend on fire and heat for like seed dispersal. So it's like very important ecologically, and the native people who lived here were aware of that because they were living on the land and paying attention to it. So they actually, kind of managed the land to a very impressive degree, where they would, select different sort of sections for burning in different seasons and do these controlled burns that would actually kind of shape different areas of the forest to their needs. So it really wasn't random. It was like a coordinated effort. Like they basically cultivated the land using fire. But yeah, the National Park Service put a stop to that. So for about 100 years, they would, every time there was a fire, they had this like system of outposts that would alert everyone. They'd put out the fires as quickly as possible, which caused a lot of dry kindling to accumulate for the past like century. So now, if you add climate change to that, where there's more droughts and more like higher temperatures, when a fire does erupt, there's like 100 years worth of material to be burnt that would have otherwise been cleared away. And you have strands of trees that grow in like incredibly close together because none of the smaller trees or older trees are being killed off by fire. So it's actually not a very natural state for the forests to be in, and a big part of why there are such massive fires that now cause billions of dollars in damage. I mean, there's also too many people, like in general, but that's like a
whole other kind of worms
issue that I can discuss at a later date.
One thing that I actually would love to talk about is the impact of like the National Park Services on Indigenous communities. It's something that is very convoluted and I need to do more research on, but like with my lab group, we work with Indigenous tribes outside of Yosemite. And I spoke with one of the tribal leaders about a lot of it, and he was just talking about how harmful, like surprisingly harmful, having like the national parks like with Yosemite and with all these other places, or not Yosemite, Yeah, Yosemite, that's not Yellowstone. Yeah, Yosemite, correct. Like having these parks is both wonderful for the landscape, but also really harmful for the native people who lived there, because like he was talking about how the border of what was his tribal land would have been into Yosemite, and because of the borders created by the National Park Service, like it completely displaced them off of that land. And that's something that I feel like we don't think about. Like I certainly don't think about, like when you think of the National Park Service and these national parks, you're like, yes, they're great. They're doing so much for the ecology. They're doing so much for like, you know, the land and for America. But then when you think about the fact that they're the ones that are pushing away from the burnings, and like this tribe that we work with, like we are the ones, like archaeologists from my team, and like along with archaeologists that are like actually working for the government, but like individual people are the ones that are helping them with the cultural burning. Like they do not, like it's crazy how much it's reminiscent of how little like sovereignty, as you brought up, these tribal like leaders in these tribal groups have, because they, in order to do the cultural burns that they've been doing for thousands of years, they have to go through the government and get grants and have archaeologists show up and have like firefighters show up and have all these people show up, and it's such an ordeal and it's so difficult. And like they can only do it like once a year now instead of however often they should. I don't know enough about that, but it's just an interesting thing that like I personally want to look more into, like the National Park Services and how that has impacted Native communities. Sorry, that's a little tangent. Anybody else have thoughts? Yes, Anne, please.
You know, one of the other things that, first of all, you guys did great. I really enjoyed that, learned a lot, and I've enjoyed the conversation. Another area, and I had actually mentioned this to Alicia when I first found out that this was going to be your topic, is that, and I don't know a lot about it, but just the apparent ongoing discrimination against Indigenous women who are missing, and there's not work being done to find these women on a comparative basis. Sophia, it looked like you had
I would like to
Sure, yes.
She wrote a wonderful article about this and VPR that I will be sending. I'll send both of these articles to y'all. I totally forgot that you both wrote articles on Indigenous rights. This is awesome. I forgot about these. Please.
Yeah, my article, it's about missing white woman syndrome, centering around, I don't know if everyone remembers the Gabby Petito case, which is when conversation around missing white woman syndrome came back into like the media, I guess. But yeah, if you guys get the chance to read it, it's
really good.
Very sad, or like not the article, but just like the information about it. And like, I hope you guys get the chance to learn more about it. But yeah.
Do you want to talk about like a little bit more about that?
Oh, sure. So, well, I don't know. For those who will not be reading the article, I can give a little synopsis. Basically, it's just the idea that it includes, it's primarily about Black and Indigenous women, Indigenous also including Latino women, but basically just that when there are certain criteria for the media to make a big hubbub about like a missing person or someone in danger, or like putting a lot of resources into keeping someone safe. And a lot of the times those criteria are young, white, and female, hence missing white woman syndrome. So Indigenous and Black women go missing at hugely disproportionate rates, often meaning they're also being assaulted and murdered at hugely disproportionate rates. But it's never really something that comes up in our media cycles. And a lot of the times what's really helpful, like the reason that it's important for missing persons cases to get pushed into the media is because everyone puts their resources into looking for them. And usually like with Gabby Petito issue, as soon as it hit like mainstream news, everything was, it was kind of like a fast chain of events that led to, like the arrest of her murderer and finding her remains and all of that. So the article just basically kind of talks about a little bit about the Gabby Petito case, but then also just highlighting Black and Indigenous people who are doing work within their own communities to try and highlight people that are missing and have been missing, and just who basically have never gotten justice because they're not deemed, let's say, desirable victims. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has anything to say on that, but oh yeah.
I just have an addition. There's a really good movie about this actually called Wind River that I highly recommend you watch. It talks about Indigenous woman who died. It's like fiction, but it's largely based on fact, and it's about like a investigator who goes, and I think in like Alaska or something, and like investigates these women who died. And a lot of times it is people who work on, it's not actual Indigenous people that are killing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Final note before it seems like we're wrapping up, but
Yes.
I just wanted to say, speaking of supporting Indigenous art, there's a show on Hulu called Reservation Dogs, created by Indigenous people with a fully Indigenous cast from Oklahoma. Not everyone in the cast is from Oklahoma, but it's set in Oklahoma on a reservation there. And I just think it's like, it's being heralded by like a lot of Indigenous communities just because there's so little like good representation of just like the way that people now are living on reservations and just like what life is like for kids growing up there. I mean, this reservation specifically that the show is about, but it's a comedy, so it's really cute and funny and really well done, and the actors are like really talented and everything. So everyone should go support that show.
And one more last note is I just really encourage, especially I know a lot of people here are from the Southeast or that area, like the best way to spark change is to talk about these things. And this is something that really isn't discussed in the Southeast often. Like we don't really think about the Indigenous people on our land, and just bringing it up in your everyday conversations is like the bare minimum of what you can do. And like saying the name, like as we mentioned earlier, as we started with, like naming is so important, and just talking about the tribal names. And it can be, I mean, it can be the, you know, the current ones that are used, but just talking about them and bringing up Siwi and bringing up Cherokee and bringing up all these different names and these different tribes and recognizing them as modern groups and not just as something that happened in the past and was just demolished from colonialism. Like that is something that can really help spark change. And I just also just encourage you in your everyday life to think about the way we think about Indigenous people and think about and like recontextualize it in your own brain and rethink about, you know, just consider why the tropes you have are what you have and think about the history behind it. And it, you know, that's it. Just look around you. Just, you know, use your senses and learn, and don't be afraid to talk to Indigenous people too and ask them about, I mean, don't be like creepy about it, but you know, interact with them.
I just wanted to say thank you to Juliette and Sofia for presenting. It was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. And also thank you to our friends that are in the UK and in Egypt for staying up so late. Thank you guys. It's great to see you. And Allie. Yes, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Oh wow!
I'm on the phone. I'm on the phone, and I'm not quite as savvy at switching back and forth. But I have been here the whole time, and it's been amazing. Sofia and Juliette, you did an amazing job and such an interesting subject. I really appreciate it, and Alicia, once again, just what a wonderful idea. And you've brought people together from all over the world, and I really appreciate the group. So thank you.
Love you, Jenna.
Love you too.
Okay, all right, guys.
Thank you.
Unless
Alicia,
anyone wants
close out.
to stay for like an after party, no.
100%. Thank you guys. It was very insightful and very interesting.
Yes.
Thanks.
And we'll try to be a little bit more organized for the next one. My bad.
Beautiful.
It was awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank
you
you
all.
guys. Thank you.
Bye, Yusuf. Bye, everyone. Good to see everyone.
Bye.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.